You look up at night and see a moving light that isn't a star. It's a satellite. There are thousands of them up there right now. Someone paid for every single one. But the real economics behind putting a company into orbit are far more interesting than you think. Start with the number that scares almost everyone off. A single satellite launch used to cost tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram. That's not a typo. For decades, getting anything into space was so expensive that only governments and a handful of telecom giants could afford to try. Then reusable rockets changed the math. Launch costs dropped by roughly an order of magnitude. What used to be a government-only game became something a well-funded startup could actually attempt. It's easy to assume this industry is still just billionaires and national space agencies. It isn't, not anymore. Beneath the headline-grabbing rocket launches sits a much larger, much quieter economy. Thousands of smaller companies that never build a rocket, never touch a launch pad, and still make real money from space. That's the part almost nobody talks about. The rocket is just the delivery truck. The actual business happens after the truck arrives, often years later, long after the launch footage has stopped trending. So how does someone actually get into this business? There isn't just one way in. There are several, and they sit at very different price points. The first path is becoming a launch provider. This is the hardest, most capital-intensive route, and it's the one most people picture when they imagine a space company. You're building the rocket itself. Think SpaceX, or a smaller player like Rocket Lab, which carved out a profitable niche by focusing on small satellite launches instead of trying to out-muscle the giants on heavy-lift missions. This path requires hundreds of millions of dollars before you ever reach orbit, deep aerospace engineering talent, and years of testing failures you'll have to survive financially. Almost nobody starts here. Most people who eventually work in this industry start somewhere else entirely. The second path is becoming a satellite operator. Instead of building the rocket, you build or buy the satellite, and you pay someone else, a launch provider, to get it into orbit. This is where most of the industry's real business activity actually happens. You're not selling rides to space. You're selling what the satellite does once it's up there: broadband internet, Earth imaging, weather data, communications relays. This is dramatically cheaper to enter than launch itself, though cheaper is relative. A single satellite can still run from a few $100,000 for a small cube satellite to tens of millions for a full communications bird. The third path, and the one with by far the lowest barrier to entry, is the ground segment and services layer. You don't build satellites or rockets at all. You build the infrastructure and software that makes satellite data useful to actual customers. Ground stations, data processing pipelines, analytics platforms that turn raw satellite imagery into something a farmer, an insurer, or a shipping company can act on. Companies in this layer often spend less to start than a mid-sized restaurant, because they're renting satellite capacity or buying raw data wholesale rather than owning any hardware in orbit at all. There's a fourth model worth knowing about, and it's become one of the fastest growing entry points in the last few years: reselling. As mega-constellations like SpaceX's Starlink have scaled up, they've opened reseller and enterprise partnership programs. You don't own a single satellite. You resell connectivity, bundle it with local installation and support services, and build a business on someone else's multi-billion-dollar infrastructure. It's the space industry's version of becoming an internet service provider without laying a single mile of cable yourself. There's a fifth path, less visible but arguably the steadiest: becoming a government or defense contractor. National space agencies and defense departments don't want to rely on a single company for launch, imaging, or communications, so they actively fund and contract smaller specialized firms to build components, provide backup imaging capacity, or manage ground infrastructure. This path comes with slower sales cycles and heavy compliance requirements, but it also comes with something rare in this industry: predictable, multi-year revenue that isn't dependent on winning over consumer or enterprise customers one deal at a time. Now let's talk about where the money actually goes, because this is where the industry stops sounding glamorous and starts sounding like every other capital-intensive business you've ever studied. If you're operating a satellite, your single biggest cost by far is getting it into orbit. Even with launch costs falling, a dedicated launch on a vehicle like Falcon 9 can run into the tens of millions of dollars, and that's before you've spent a cent on the satellite itself. Shared, rideshare launches, where your satellite is one of dozens packed onto the same rocket, bring that number down dramatically, sometimes to a few $1,000,000 or less, but you lose control over your exact orbit and launch timing. Then there's the satellite itself. Manufacturing costs have fallen sharply thanks to mass production techniques, the same way a car built on an assembly line costs less per unit than one built by hand. Small satellites can now be built for a few $100,000. Larger, more capable communications or imaging satellites still run into the tens of millions. Either way, you're paying for this before you've earned a single dollar of revenue, which is why most satellite operators raise significant venture capital or take on debt long before they're profitable. Insurance is the cost nobody outside the industry thinks about, and it's enormous. Launch insurance, which covers the possibility of your satellite being destroyed on the way up, can run into the millions of dollars per mission. In-orbit insurance, covering equipment failure once you're up there, adds another recurring cost. Insurers price this based on the track record of your specific rocket and satellite design, which means newer, less proven hardware costs significantly more to insure. A brutal irony for any startup trying to break into the industry with novel technology. Some early-stage operators skip insurance altogether and simply accept the risk of total loss, treating the launch itself like a coin flip they've budgeted for in advance, a decision that would sound reckless in almost any other industry. And yet here it's a fairly common, calculated bet. Then there's spectrum and licensing. Before you can transmit a single signal from orbit, you need regulatory approval. In the United States, that means the Federal Communications Commission, and internationally, coordination through the International Telecommunication Union. This isn't a formality. Usable radio spectrum is a genuinely scarce resource, and getting the rights to use a specific frequency band can take years of regulatory filings and, in competitive cases, real money-changing hands for priority access. Ground infrastructure rounds out the major cost centers. Satellites need ground stations to communicate with, antennas, data centers, and network operations to keep everything running. Building your own ground station network is expensive, which is why many smaller operators rent capacity from ground station as a service providers instead of building anything themselves. Then there's staffing. Mission control doesn't run itself. You need engineers monitoring satellite health around the clock, because unlike a piece of equipment on the ground, you can't send someone to physically inspect or repair a malfunctioning satellite. Every fix has to happen remotely, through software commands sent from a ground station, which means your engineering team is effectively the only maintenance crew your multi-million-dollar asset will ever have. So who else is involved in all of this, beyond the company itself? More people than you'd expect. There's the launch provider, who is effectively your logistics partner and your biggest single vendor. There are the regulators, the FCC and ITU for spectrum and licensing, and national space agencies that oversee safety and orbital debris compliance. There are insurers, who effectively underwrite whether your business is viable enough to risk covering. There are ground station operators, who lease you the infrastructure to actually talk to your own hardware. There are component manufacturers, who supply the sensors, solar panels, and propulsion systems that go into every satellite, and whose reliability directly determines whether your mission succeeds or fails. There are venture capital and private equity investors, who fund the years-long gap between spending on hardware and earning back revenue. And increasingly, there are data customers, agriculture companies, shipping and logistics firms, government defense agencies, insurers who use satellite imagery to assess climate risk, who are the ones actually paying the bills once your satellite is operational. Now for the challenges, because this industry has plenty, and they're not the ones people usually assume. The most obvious one is technical failure. A rocket can explode on the launch pad. A satellite can fail to deploy its solar panels once in orbit. These aren't hypothetical risks. They're a normal, expected part of the industry's history, which is exactly why insurance costs so much. You're not just building a product. You're building a product you cannot repair once it leaves the ground. The second challenge is orbital congestion and space debris. Low Earth orbit, where most modern satellites operate, is getting crowded. Every operator now has to factor in collision avoidance maneuvers and end-of-life deorbiting plans, both of which cost fuel, engineering time, and money. Regulators are only getting stricter about this, not looser, which means the cost of being a responsible operator is rising across the industry. The third challenge is that this is fundamentally a capital-intensive, long payback business. You're spending millions before your first satellite even generates revenue. And even after it's operational, satellites have a limited operational lifespan, often 5 to 15 years depending on the orbit and mission, after which you need to replace them entirely. This isn't a business where you build something once and coast. It's a business where the capital expenditure never really stops. The fourth challenge, and maybe the most underestimated one, is that launch is not actually your product. Your product is whatever the satellite does once it's up there: data, connectivity, imaging. And that means you're competing on the same terms as any other data or connectivity business. A satellite broadband provider isn't just competing with other satellite companies. It's competing with fiber, with 5G, with every terrestrial alternative that doesn't have to survive a rocket launch first. The fifth challenge is scale itself. A handful of dominant players now control the vast majority of active satellites in orbit, and that concentration keeps growing. When one company can launch its own satellites at a fraction of what it costs anyone else, smaller operators either have to find a niche too small or too specialized for the giants to bother with, or they have to build their business explicitly on top of the giants' infrastructure instead of trying to compete with it directly. Picking the wrong side of that decision is one of the fastest ways a new entrant runs out of money. So what does a genuinely useful first step look like? If you were seriously curious about this industry rather than just fascinated by it, almost nobody should start by trying to build a rocket or even a satellite. The lowest risk, most realistic entry point today is the ground segment and services layer, building software, analytics, or reseller businesses on top of existing satellite infrastructure that already exists. Companies are doing exactly this right now, turning raw satellite imagery into usable agricultural insights, turning connectivity into last-mile internet service for rural regions, turning orbital data into insurance risk models. You don't need hundreds of millions of dollars to start there. You need a specific, underserved use case and the software skills to build on top of infrastructure someone else already spent billions building. Think about it this way. When the automobile was first invented, the fortunes weren't only made by the handful of companies building the cars. They were made by the people who figured out what to do around the car: gas stations, insurance products, roadside service, parts suppliers. Space is at that same stage right now. The rockets exist. The satellites exist. The infrastructure is largely built. What's still wide open is everything that gets built on top of it, and that's a far more approachable place to start than most people assume. And here's the counterintuitive truth worth sitting with. The barrier to entry in space isn't really rockets anymore. It used to be. Now the rockets exist, launch costs have fallen dramatically, and mega-constellations have already built the connectivity backbone. The real opportunity, and the real bottleneck, has shifted to what you do with access to orbit once it's cheap and available. The company that wins isn't necessarily the one that builds the best hardware. It's the one that finds the most valuable thing to do with data or connectivity that's already up there. That moving light you saw overhead isn't just a satellite anymore. It's an income statement, quietly orbiting the planet, waiting for someone to figure out what to do with it. Someone will. The only real question left is whether it's you.